connect and gather together virtually. So we would like to give thanks to God for that. And once again, we're having a session for our mental health seminar. Um, there is a technical difficulty that we experienced today. I'm not able to receive email from Pastor Walker, so unfortunately, I don't have the information to introduce our speaker, but our speaker is kind-hearted enough that he said he will volunteer himself, introduce himself. So I will give now the time to Dr. Ainsworth Lightbody to tell us about himself, a little bit of himself, before he would go to our main session tonight. Doctor, back to you.
Good night, everyone, and happy Sabbath. I want to believe that I'm no brother and no stranger. As Pastor Walker indicated last week, I'm the first elder at First Missouri City Seventh Adventist Church in Missouri City. And I am married to Karen Lightbody. We also have a daughter, and we our implants are used in air, but we love it here. Should I say that? It is always a up of what? Families and people. And if people are impacted by mental health, then by default, the church is also impacted by mental health. Last week, we studied about trauma, and we talked about the different symptoms of trauma, and I answered several questions regarding trauma. And today, it's a short time to do this because I would have liked to have done several, like a series. But in the interest of time, I've moved from trauma. I would have liked to have done a whole thing about how to cope with trauma, but that will take several presentations. However, because it is Sabbath, I'm going to focus on how to become a trauma-informed care church. And Sister Wright has a profound writing. Give me 1 second. Sister White has a writing that she published in Acts of the Apostles and also in 2 Corinthians 14, 4 verse 15 and Ephesians 3 verse 10. And it reads, the church is God's appointed. So remember, we're focusing on how to become a trauma-informed care church. And she said that the church is God's appointed agency for the salvation of men. It was organized for service, and its mission is to carry the gospel to the world. From the beginning, it has been God's plan that through his church shall be reflected to the world his fullness and his sufficiency. The members of the church, those whom he has called out of darkness into his marvelous light, are to show forth his glory. The church is the repository of the riches of God's grace. Through the church will eventually be made manifest, even to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, the final and full display of the love of God. The church is God's fortress, she continues, his city of refuge, which he holds in a revolted world. So I will stop right there with the church is God's fortress in his city of refuge, which he holds in a revolted world. It therefore means, can I get any feedback from anyone? What does this mean to you as a church who's providing trauma care to those who come in need? Have you ever heard the saying that church is a hospital?
Yes.
Yes. So any feedback from this statement, the mission of the church?
I think that means that we're supposed to be prayerful, supportive, selfless, considerate of those that are experiencing trauma.
Yes, that's the perfect summary of the whole thing. The church, we a lot of times we talk about mission, evangelism, right? And we have to remember that as people are coming into the church, what are they going to bring with them? They're going to be bringing them their baggages, their issues, which includes their trauma. So as we're providing God's word to them, we also have to be attending to their needs as well. And so this is where we are at right now. We also have to provide to their care. Okay, so I would like to start off by talking about what is a trauma-informed care church. And then, but let's start off with generally, what is trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care is understanding and considering the pervasive nature of trauma. When we talk about trauma, we provide a definition of a trauma. It's an unexpected event that kept the individual helpless, right? And that it changes their what? Their worldview, right? Their perception of the world, right? And that most times they have difficulty coping after the event has occurred. So with that being said, and we have folks who are coming in, folks who have been sexually assaulted, folks who have been physically assaulted, folks who have observed domestic violence, like children. We have folks who have had major accidents, lots of trauma, right? Lots of trauma. They're coming into the church and they're bringing those with them. So how do we as a church? It starts off with understanding. It's not knowing the person has trauma that's critical. It's understanding and considering the pervasive nature. It's over time. It may have happened 15 years ago. And promoting an environment of healing and recovery rather than practices and services that may inadvertently re-traumatize someone. What I'm saying is that, for example, someone coming to the church, some of our church members like to yell because we have a position where whether the elder or the superintendent, we are yelling at people, right? I've seen that happening, or we are speaking down to people, right? And so we don't want that as we're providing service. We want to say, hey, I don't know if Brother Brown or Sister Jane has had a traumatic experience, and therefore I'm going to approach her or him or everyone with a sense of caution. Remember last week I said I don't just go and hug people? Remember? Because someone who's been traumatized, especially sexual trauma, does not want to be touched. So if I'm going to hug someone, I say to them, Sister Brown, can I give you a big hug? And she say, of course. Then that's okay. But I may want to hug Sister Brown and may cause a reaction, and that could be problematic, right? So I'm still hugging, I'm still shaking hands, I'm still patting on the shoulder, but I'm doing it from a trauma-informed care approach where I'm letting the person know, hey, I'm going to give you a hug. Is it okay? And then I move forward. And that's understanding that, hey, I don't know what this person has had, so I'm going to approach with caution. And that's where we start being trauma-informed care, understanding that someone may have had a traumatic event, and we have to approach with caution. So when we think about trauma-informed care, we think of a roadmap, right? We think of a roadmap and what that would look like for individuals as they experience a traumatic event. So when we think of a roadmap, we think of a road and there are signs along the road as you journey on. And so one of the first things that is important in becoming a trauma-informed care church is addressing any potential re-traumatization policy. So we're going to put policies in place that will help others. So for example, I share with my board of elders that we're never to, like I talk about, hey, don't just go hugging and touching people. We talked about, not raising your voice or using your power as an abuse to others. Or if you have to address a situation with someone, you don't do it from a dictatorial approach or with an attitude. You want to be in a way that's going to be respectful, right? We talk about, don't just say, what's wrong with you, little girl, or what's wrong with you. We're going to go and say, what's going on with you, right? So that's creating those policies in place at the church so that members, whether it's your board of elders, can approach individuals with that sense of trauma-informed care. Also, we want to encourage, at my church, we do have a team. But looking for us, we have other clinicians there. And so we have a team of individuals. If someone just says, hey, I've had a traumatic experience, or it's what's going on with me, that they can get some attention to address their situation on the moment. Because once a trauma symptoms have been activated, sometimes it's very difficult for the individual to pull back. And so sometimes they may have difficulty breathing or difficulty staying focused, and may just really have in a really bad episode. And so we have a team of clinicians there that are trained to do that. But that's something that your local church can get some training in, where we have some members. If this is happening, you have a nurse on board, they would have had some second can also be able to provide those support, right? And also just encouraging a sense of a trauma-informed care culture across the board. And that is where we're encouraging our males, how they approach the females or they approach people in general, that they have to be very mindful about that, right? And so I remember one client told me that, part of her, when she had a traumatic event, she went into depression. And because one of the ways she coped with her depression was increasing her appetite increased. And so she was eating more. She was, just eating more and eating more. And so if she's eating more, not exercising, what's going to happen? Eating more, no exercise, laying in bed all the time, inactive, weight gain. And so when you look at her and says, Sister Jane, you're fat. What do you think that's going to do to her? Re-traumatize her, right? And so we have to be very mindful about, the things that we're saying. So we want to create a culture where folks are learning. And so even if I'm at church and I hear, a brother or another person said something to someone that I think is unkind and could activate a traumatic memory for someone, I would, quickly say, can I just talk to you for a second? And I said, I was passing by and I heard, what you said to Sister Jane. I'm sorry if there's a Sister Jane, please, it's not you. I heard what you said, Sister Jane. Remember our trauma-informed care policy and the things we talked about that? What are your thoughts? Do you think that was a very trauma-informed approach you took? Or do you think that was something that could have, hurt her feelings? And more often than not, they'll say, yeah, you're right. I was just joking. And I said, I agree. I'm sure you were joking. You were laughing. But, we have to be very mindful, right? So you kind of want to make sure that the culture is supportive of that and that the culture is being maintained through reminders and all that good stuff, right? So that's also very important. Again, this culture doesn't happen overnight. Because why? The church is made up of people from different cultures. I know in my church alone, we have people from Trinidad, we have people from Jamaica, we have people from St. Croix, we have individuals from St. Kitts, St. Lucia. So we have, the Americas, we have a wide variety of individuals. And so people come with different cultures and their views. Some islands are rougher than others. And so, we try to maintain a balance by providing training first to our elders, because they're the ones who are helping to manage your people. And, and then they will, of course, trickle down that to the church itself. Also, we also want to be checking from time to time, are there anyone in the church who has had a traumatic event and they could benefit from having what we call a support group, right? Individuals. So just come and just talk. In talking about your trauma, you don't have to be talking about, oh, when I was raped, or oh, when my husband was beating me up, right? You can simply say, when I had my trauma, which could be anything. When I had my trauma, because the focus is not so much the event or who did it, but more so, how did it impact you and how are you coping currently, right? Are you coping very well? If you're not coping very well, what do you have in place? If you have nothing in place, okay, here are some recommendations of places that can provide support for you, or at least attend a support group to recognize that you're not alone and that your voice can be heard because you're in a circle of people who understands your pain and can share how they're coping in healthy ways, right? So that's kind of creating that roadmap, and that comes with the administration, right? The pastor and his board of elders, right? And once they have put that culture in place or that policy in place, then it goes to the church board, and of course the church board discuss it, and then it kind of implement, passes on to the members of the church. So that's kind of creating a roadmap to becoming trauma-informed care. So there are 4 R's of trauma-informed care, and one is to realize. So realizing the widespread impact of trauma. As we talk about the church, it's God's repository on earth where people are coming in. It's a hospital for sinners. And when people come in, right, they are going to come in with, again, all kinds of illnesses, mental health issues. They're going to come in with financial issues, all kinds of issues, right? But because we're focused on trauma, we want to recognize and understand the potential path for recovery, right? There is a path for recovery for individuals with trauma. And so we want to recognize that, hey, there is hope, right? And especially the Seventh Adventists, we have the blessed hope in the coming of the Lord. So besides providing treatment, we're also providing prayerful support as well. So one, we realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. 2, we want to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients. So, for example, and of course, as you get some training and become more familiar with this content, again, I'll be more than happy to come back and do a more focused, extensive presentation over as like a series on trauma. It's where you recognize the signs and symptoms. So, for example, you see a little girl in church who is just fast with we call her fast, right? She just hang out with the boys and just really inappropriate, and you feel like, rather than think that she's just a wild girl and she's just promiscuous, you might want to recognize that that could be some trauma there, and you may just want to, again, recognizing signs. So a couple of signs we have, or even conversation. I heard one. I was just sitting casually, and I heard somebody says, "Oh, I'm not going around there. I avoid going around, dark places or anywhere where there's nobody else." And I said to her, "Hey, have you ever had a traumatic event that relates to being unsafe?" And she says, "Yes. Why did you ask?" I said, "No, I just heard you say that, you wouldn't go around. Sounds like you're avoiding. Is that the only place you avoid?" She says, "Yes. If I'm at home alone, I'm not ever at home alone. I always have somebody there with me, or if I know nobody's going to be at home, I don't go home." And so I proceeded to say, "So your trauma happened at home?" And she says, "Yes." I said, "Okay, that makes sense." But of course, she transfers that same from home to other places where there's no one else around, right? So you'll be able to recognize symptoms, signs, or you might realize that you touch someone on the shoulder, not from behind, they saw you, but it just creates that, like hypervigilance, or, or they'll fan you off or they'll hit at you. You realize that sometimes folks are joking, but you can kind of realize that it's not a joke. They're really serious because I really impacted them. And so, you might want to, not in a nosy way, but in a way to say, "I noticed that you were very hypervigilant the other day," or that you were just really edgy. Is everything okay? I'm here to support, and if you want to talk. By that, you are not imposing yourself onto them, but just letting them aware that, hey, I recognize that you kind of responded differently than the norm, or I realized that I heard you said something that kind of triggered some thoughts in my head. And so, I'd like to know, is it okay? Would you like to talk? Or if, at least not with me, we've got a team at church of folks that you can talk with, just so that there's resources away. The third one is, the third R of trauma. So there are 3 R's: realize, recognize, respond. Respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into the church culture and practices, right? So, again, you can individually go do some reading, you can go to trainings, but be able to respond in ways like saying to a sister, "I realize that that you have been, hanging around with the boys, and that's not normal. Are you okay? What's going on with you? Would you like to talk? Why don't you hang with the girls?" And she might say, "Oh, because I'm a tomboy and I prefer playing with boys because I grew up with brothers." Reasonable explanation. But if she says that, you know, I don't want to talk about it, please don't force, because again, we don't want to re-traumatize them. But you might want to be able to respond by saying, hey, we've got a team at church, or we know this professional, or, or here are some resources that if you want to talk, you can be able to get those. So you really want to respond to that, right? And not just sit on the fence and be judgmental. And then you want to resist re-traumatizing someone. And so how do we resist re-traumatizing someone? A lot of times when folks have been traumatized, somebody had some power over them, right? So we don't want to use our power church to overpower individuals and to make people feel less than, right? And so that could cause re-traumatization. I always tell, sometimes I see, even in my church, where adults would raise their voice at children, and I would encourage them not to do that, because if they're already traumatized by dad raising the voice at home or speaking them in very demeaning ways, can you imagine you doing that again at church? That's re-traumatization. And so the fourth R is resisting doing anything that could possibly re-traumatize, like touching, yelling, screaming, or just using your power to demean or belittle someone or put them in a very helpless situation. So there are some action plans that the church could undertake. One is the board could embrace a policy regarding trauma-informed care to say, hey, this is our policy as a board, and this is what we're going to be putting in place. Also, we could have all heads of departments being trained in trauma-informed care principles relevant to their department. So for example, if we have the children's department, we're going to encourage our Sabbath school teachers to be gentle, not to yell and scream, but to provide a nurturing environment. If we are working with the young adults, the Adventist youth team, we encourage Adventist youth leaders that you want to ensure that individuals are not yelling and screaming at kids or talking to kids demeaningly, because, hey, they might have been exposed. Or if we see another boy poking a girl or even hitting at someone, we don't want to encourage that, because that could also re-traumatize an individual, right? So how do we do this? The easiest thing is it's a get-together we call a trauma-informed care committee, consisting of pastors, elders, head deacon, head deaconess, usher, Sabbath school superintendent, and division leader, and in some instances, a safety. I don't know if your church has a safety officer, but and also a pattern leader if applicable. So when you have this team coming together, they are going to be able to say, yeah, I realized that in my AY time, I've observed this, or in Sabbath school, or the elders may have a more broader overview of what's going on with the church. And so together you can come and you can decide, okay, we're going to have a program for trauma, we're going to have workshops for trauma, we're going to have support groups of trauma. We're going to ensure that there are policies and things in place for trauma, so that we want to ensure that those things are in place at the church. So that's kind of very important, right? One big thing I try to encourage churches to do is to ensure that members who interact with children, such as Sabbath school teachers, pathfinder leaders, etc., complete the relevant child abuse training and background verification as stipulated by the General Conference or your local conference, right? It's called the Veritide Volunteers Program. This is very important especially, because a lot of times individuals, even at our churches, become assaulted, right? It's not unusual for that to happen. In fact, the research has shown that the church is a very lucrative ground for sexual assault, right? And what reason being, parents are very trusting of just letting their kids run about on their own. Parents trust other church members because they are brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so. And that's why a lot of times assault and trauma happens right under our nose. So even when I'm at church, right, whether I'm the elder on duty or not, I encourage my elders to do that, is when I see kids running off from their parents, I usually steer them back in, right? Because sometimes the kids will be running outside and then they end up in the churchyard unattended. And you're thinking that, oh yeah, there's somebody outside there, but nope, there's nobody outside. The kids are on their own unattended. And again, they could become victims, right? So we want to ensure that, that we are encouraging folks to get verified, and we're encouraging folks to also just be monitoring our children as they're moving around in the church, right? Especially like even going off the bathrooms and stuff like that. Because I know some churches have the bathrooms in the basement, some churches have bathrooms in the very back and out of the reach of the general population, right? So those are some things that are important to consider as you're, moving towards becoming a trauma-informed care church. And again, remember, your church may not have this current issue, but as we are bringing folks into the world, I can't tell you how many. In the clinic today, just today, I saw 4 clients out of 10 who have had trauma-related issues, right? That's impacting their behavior. And then there are another 2 that had a history of post-traumatic stress disorder. So trauma is just a prevalent thing that happens to people. And so as we're bringing more people, as we're opening up our doors to inviting people in, remember that they're going to be coming in. We don't want them to come and we're unprepared. We want them to come into a prepared church that has things. So one thing is that we want to foster at our churches a sense of safety, right? A sense of safety. Safety is very big, not just only physical safety where things are not falling onto people, but safety about not being assaulted, and then just safety that I can come here and not have to worry, right? And that only comes about when we know that our deacons are on the ball, that our deaconesses are on the ball, ensuring that I discourage a lot of movements at the church. I usually encourage members to take a seat on the inside. I know we have to go to the bathroom, but because we don't have a lot of people moving around, it makes it easier to monitor and spot things that are happening. And so, even in sitting in church and even our presentations, as speakers, whenever I'm speaking, if I say something that I think would trigger someone, I'm always looking at my audience to see facial expressions and how folks are responding to what I'm saying. All right, so another thing about creating a trauma-informed care culture is that we want to create a culture where members feel they can trust to share something as deep as a traumatic event. I can't forget in a church, in a prior church I attended, the pastor's wife attended and shared her traumatic event when she was assaulted. And some folks are like, why would she say that? But she said that if I can't trust you as my brothers and sisters, then who am I going to trust, right? And so as Seventh-day Adventists, we talk about the fact that we are brothers and sisters in Christ, right? And we talk about, we're part of the family of God. When one, you know that song, I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. And one of the stanzas says, when one has a heartache, we all share the pain because we're a family and we hold each other so dear. And so we want to create a culture where members feel they can trust to share something as deep as a traumatic event. Because remember, a lot of times people don't want to talk about it, right? And so for me, I get a lot of that because of my role as my profession. But then there are others, who may not want to speak to a professional. They just want to share with someone. And so if you are that chosen person, please remember, do not share it with your husbands or your wives or your best friends or another brother and sister. You hold that in confidence, because that going out there could create a lot of traumatic event, re-traumatization of that individual. So we want to create culture. And how does someone trust you? Because as a family, we're going to become what? Closely bonded, not just superficially, but deeply bonded. And so once we become deeply bonded, it's so much easier for folks to share with you how they're feeling, and maybe you're able to provide some support for them. So remember that, victims often blame themselves, often feel ashamed, and often lose their voices. And so I would encourage you not to blame them or make them feel guilty. Sometimes I've heard individuals say, well, I'm so sorry it happened to you, but if you hadn't worn that very short dress, that would not have happened to you. You just blame them. Well, really, even if she went there naked, that abuser had no right to abuse. You see what I mean? And so we don't want to, even though we feel like, the dress was short, it kind of may have triggered the guy, or whatever the trauma is, right? And that's just an example I'm giving. But we don't want to let individuals feel blame. Or, you know what? It was Sabbath. If you didn't take the car and go out there, you wouldn't have had the accident. We understand that. But is that the time to do it? No. maybe you can still pass that message on, but by saying, you know, Tom, in the future, you might want to not go to the club or use the car to do things that are not of God on the Sabbath. But never say, if you hadn't taken the car on the Sabbath, that wouldn't have happened to you. Because again, you're blaming, or let them feel ashamed, right? Because then they're never going to talk about it again. Because you know what? Who wants to be blamed? Who wants to be made to feel guilty, right? No one wants that, right? And so you kind of want to discourage that. Also, encourage members to show genuine concern towards each other. It's not just about saying, Happy Sabbath, right? I like to say, Happy Sabbath, how are you? Right? Or how are you doing today? Or how was your week? Right? It's an extra step to show that you're not just making a statement, but you're also concerned about me, right? Happy Sabbath is giving the extra boost. No, not just say, Happy Sabbath, how are you? And be walking along. Then that's kind of like, that's just like just a saying, right? You want to say Happy Sabbath and pause for a response, right? Without stopping for a response, it's pointless. That's just you're saying something that comes from your mouth, right? You want to pause for a response in case the person is giving it. If the person keeps walking, not giving a response, then that's your cue to keep walking. But you, since you said those things, Happy Sabbath, you want to stop if you're asking, how are you? Because you're asking, how are you? That's a question. How are you? The question, which means you're expecting a response. And so in order to get a response, you have to stop and listen, okay? So that is important. We talk about judgments, right? So you want to create a culture where judgment is suspended until more information is obtained. So instead of saying what's wrong with you, try asking what's going on with you. That'll have to show that more sense of care. And again, remember, you know, God talks about leaving judgment to himself because we make judgments and sometimes we're totally wrong. And so we want to be more supportive. So if you felt that somebody is doing something wrong, we don't have to go and be pointing fingers, right? We can, in a loving way, ask questions. Say, hey, Tommy, you know, why do you feel the need to yell? Or why do you feel the need to always be, you know, screaming or doing whatever you're doing? And allow him and listen. Allow him to provide a response. I just scream because I want to. Well, why do you want to scream? What's going on inside? You're screaming for something. Are you needing more attention? Are you screaming because you're trying to get something off your chest? What's going on, right? Tell me. And I know that I could be wrong, so go ahead and tell me. Let's hear it, right? And so you try to work with that individual. So you're not providing judgment, you're suspending judgment, because when we feel judged, we shut down. If you know that somebody's always judging you, after a while you get tired and shut down, right? So we want to be very mindful of that. As a church, we don't want to be judging people like that. I did talk about the physical contact, just encourage members to be mindful in making physical contact with another member, such as hugging. Again, we want to be Christ-like and we want to hug. I'm not discouraging hug. We should hug. I hug all the time, but I just don't hug people. Or if I'm hugging someone, you know, you hug from the side for females because you don't want to feel as if you're imposing upon them. And so you want to be very mindful about that because again, we're creating trauma-informed care church where we're being sensitive about what's going on with others. Another thing that's very important that people tend to overlook is lighting. In some churches, in some areas, it's very dark. You want to make sure areas that involve people's movement or where people could go is lit up, right? If you have doors that are not, like rooms that are not being used, you know, like extra rooms, it's a good idea just to put a lock on them so people don't go off where they can also get assaulted or abused as well. So those are important. How can you, if you're carrying a trauma and you have not been treated and you realize that, hey, I'm having flashbacks, I'm avoiding situations. I did define those last week. I'm avoiding situations. I'm having some, reaction to this. What should I do, right? What should I do when I have had a traumatic event, right? I am going to encourage you to confide in someone you trust, someone who is not judgmental, right? Because just talking about your trauma, whether it's an accident or whatever it is, just talking about it is going to be a lot better than you holding it in. okay? Because after a while, it's going to keep piling until you explode and feel like, what happened? She always looks so composed. So fine, hopefully you can find someone that you can trust. That's important. And again, trust comes out of relationship. If you're going to a church and you trust no one there, that's concerning, right? That's concerning. It's my policy. It does not have to be yours. It's my policy. I don't share my personal business or anything related to my life with my colleagues at work or individuals who are not Christians, only because when you start telling people, oh, my husband is beating me up, and and he doesn't provide food, and he's a horrible man, he sits and he drinks, they're gonna come and figure like, oh, and you say you have Christ on your side. Okay, if he can't help you, I don't think I need him. So we have to be very mindful about how we're telling folks our business. Of course, going to a professional is not the same. It's fine that we're trained to listen and to provide feedback and support for you. But if you I don't discourage you from sharing your things with others on the outside, but find someone in the church. That's important. Someone that you can trust. You can find it. If you don't have someone in the church that you can trust, it's time to start looking around. Because a lot of times we feel we're the only one that people can trust, but you're not the only one. There are others that feel inside there, right? And so you want to reach out to others and to be able to talk about how you're feeling and how you can best be supported. And I like to say to individuals, hey, I'm going to share something with you, but it's not for you to provide feedback. All I want to do is just to vent. So that's my key. That's a person's cue. Don't talk, just listen. I don't need your feedback. I don't need anything from you. I just want to be heard because I want to get it off my chest. Or they'll come and say, I'm going to share something that happened to me and I just want to hear what your thoughts are. And that's your cue to provide support, right? And so that's kind of how you want to do this, right? Of course, besides that, if someone comes and shares a traumatic event that you feel is beyond your ability to provide support, you want to recommend the individual seek professional help. And a lot of times people are resistant to treatment because they're ashamed, they're not motivated because they're feeling depressed. And so what I would encourage is that you'll say, hey, last week we spoke, you shared something with me and I did recommend that you seek professional help. Did you make it? How is that? Give me an update on that. You might say, oh, I haven't done anything yet. And you might want to say, hey, why didn't you do it? Is because you didn't know how to find information? What's going on? And say, no, I was so busy and I just want to think about it. Would it be okay? Again, we're asking, would it be okay if I got the information from you on a sheet of paper and send it to you via text or whatever other medium? And they'll say yes. And so you send. And so you probably can say, hey, I sent you the stuff. Did you check in? What's going on? Is everything okay? And they'll say, no, I haven't gone yet. And this is week number 4. No, I'm gone. I'm going to go. And this is I'm going to say, hey, listen, how about if I go with you? I'll take the day off from work or I'm not working this particular day. Would it be okay if I go with you, right? And so you're encouraging to support. But a lot of times people with trauma are often exhibiting symptoms of depression and anxiety, and so they don't have that motivation to go and seek help. And so a lot of times they tend to ruminate over the event and become, re-traumatized, or they become symptomatic. So you want to also do that with them. So one of the thoughts I want to put out there with you, and I'm going to have some time to question and answer, is do not live in fear. Do not live in fear, but act like you are aware. You are aware of what could happen to someone or what has happened to someone. And you don't have to be afraid. Like a lot of times I hear folks say, oh, Mary's mom died, or I heard that something happened to Mary, but I don't know what to say to her. And so you see Mary and you say nothing. Don't be afraid to say, Mary, I heard about your traumatic event. I'm so sorry. You don't have to say much. I'm here to support you. I'm praying for you. If you ever want to talk, I'm available. And that's enough. But some folks will figure, I don't know what to say. I don't know if I'm going to offend them. Or it's already out there. So hey, show your support and also give your sense of awareness. Practicing trauma-informed care will not eradicate abuse that the individual is experiencing or the trauma itself, but it will certainly minimize the prevalence, right? And also minimize the impact it will continue to have on the individual. Because as individuals start to talk about the traumatic event and you're providing some support, or you encourage them to go get help, is that as they are letting things off and able to talk more comfortable things and they're dealing with and processing the event, then they will what is going to happen? It's going to minimize the prevalence and also help the individual on the path of recovery. Also, it's important that you reinforce safe practices at church. Again, we're talking about creating a informed care church. And remember, suspend judgment about the behavior of others as a sincere brother and sister finds out, as a sincere brother and sister find out what's going on so that you can be the best support you can be. Again, bear in mind that the church is a hospital for sinners. And in a hospital, we don't pick and choose what comes in, they come in. I remember when I worked in the emergency room, and for those of you who are nurses on the platform, we don't pick and choose what comes in, right? The only time I see emergency rooms pick and choose is where if it's a pediatric emergency room, then we're only expecting children, not adults, right? And if it's an adult emergency room, then we can see both, right? So that's very important that we don't pick and choose and minimize people who come into the church. We want to be a church that is loving, embracing, understanding, compassionate, empathetic, and most importantly, Christ-like. Because again, in the world, the prevalence of trauma is very high, and the church is made up of people in the world, such as you and I. And so as I bring this section to a close, I'll be opening the floor to answer questions you may have from last week about trauma, as well as what else can I do to ensure that my church becomes trauma-informed care, because we're having crusades, evangelistic series, and we want to bring people in to the church who would have had some trauma. All right, any question?
So this is
Good night. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, Maurice, go ahead. You go.
Oh, Charlotte, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. So my question is kind of dealing a little bit more with culture, right?
Culture.
Many cultures dismiss the effects of trauma and the I guess the importance of it and the importance on how to address it. And considering that, I guess many churches, in my experience, are predominantly populated by those kinds of cultures, how do you address it? And how do you say, yeah, I've had some trauma, as opposed to suppressing it and maybe exhibiting those behaviors that trauma, one that has experienced trauma, like maybe overeating or sleeping a lot, not coming to church. How do you address it with consideration to, people's backgrounds?
So one of the things, as I shared in my example. So for example, Asian cultures are a lot more quiet. I'm not saying all Asians are, right? But Asian cultures are a lot more quiet on the discussion of trauma, especially with sexual assault. And so because the conversation is taboo, it's not that open. And so, this is where the church will come together and say, hey, we're going to provide some educational resources where you can have a series of presentations on trauma. If you feel that, in fact, I believe all churches should have, a committee related to that. Because I do presentations online, and I have I would say 95% of my clients are Seventh-day Adventists, and I stay busy all day long. I rarely have spaces unless a client has finished their course of program, but I stay booked out. And you'd be amazed at how many wives have been physically abused, whether the wife of the pastors or an elder or just a church member, physically abused. And so that's trauma in itself, right? And so, we don't want to take it for granted that so I think every church should have a team of individuals who spend some time researching and reading and getting trained about trauma, because it exists within the church. And so, we want to, and it's okay to say, for example, if I'm in a church where I know that particular culture is very quiet on these conversations, that I would start by saying, I'm going to be raising a very important topic that I know it's very sensitive. I know most of you, based on their culture, it's a very quiet conversation, never really spoken about. But it's important to us that we have these conversations, because talking about your trauma, not just telling about, oh, this had happened, but talking about how it's impacting you and talking about the symptoms you're experiencing and getting help is important. Because remember, if my trauma is being activated because, let's say, a wife is married and her husband is physically assaulting her, right? And so she perhaps have nowhere else to go. She perhaps have the kids and realize that I can't take the kids and I don't want the kids to know, and all these kinds of stuff, right? What is going to do? She's going to, a lot of times, as I mentioned last week, is that people exhibit these their responses through anxiety and depression. So when we talk about somebody who is depressed, right? What are some of the symptoms of depression? Lack of interest in things they previously enjoyed, lack of motivation to what? To study the word of God, right? We also have what? They're probably sleeping, they're having negative thoughts. I am no good. If I'm no good, I can't make it to heaven, right? Because bad people don't go to heaven. So if I think I'm bad, I'm no good, am I going to make it to heaven? Another symptom of depression is hopelessness. We talk about we are a church with the hope, the blessed hope. But if I have no hope, that includes not having the blessed hope. And so that's the way I would use to say, so if all these are happening, research has shown that talking about your trauma in support groups or in therapy, or even just with someone, helps. It helps you to start speaking, because a lot of times they lose their voice and don't want to talk about it because they have shame and guilt. And so just being able to talk it through is important. And so that's kind of how I would engage the culture, by allowing folks to be sensitive about other people's potential trauma.
So in a nutshell, you suggest that most churches create a mental health awareness system that facilitates people to seek out the service. Okay,
Correct.
so my question is just for confirmation. I'm not sure if you mentioned this in the first session, but trauma creates different neural pathways.
It does.
Okay.
And what I did say that it rewires the brain and sometimes allow you to think in ways that are just really negative. Also, from trauma, trauma is the mother of borderline personality disorder. And that's a whole other topic again, where people they experience this emotional dysregulation.
Right.
Sometimes they hurting themselves, or they just have poor relations. They have this really, 1 minute they're high, 1 minute they're low, not bipolar now. They have 1 minute they're able to function, another minute it's as if the world is spinning around them. And so it's just very chaotic. They operate in chaos, right? And so trauma is the mother of borderlines, right? And so again, and that's the rewiring of the brain, those negative thinking, that's the rewiring of the brain.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Was it Maurice that had a question?
Yes. Good night. Happy Sabbath, Dr. Lightbody, and all my brothers and sisters. The question is, after you have developed a relationship with someone in the church and you confide in them and you express to them your deepest secrets and about your traumatic experience, and now they turn around and tell almost half the church, and then they get back to you, how would you encourage one? Because that's like double trauma now. How do you encourage one to stay in the church and not walk away, and to cope with a situation like that?
Situation of such.
Yes. Okay. So what I would do with the individual, of course, I would. So let's say it was Brother Maurice, and he said to me, what? I told Brother Harry, and he has told half the church. I would validate. I would let you know. I would emphasize, Brother Maurice, I'm so sorry that happened. That should never have happened. Because as a family, we're supposed to support each other, and what we are supporting is holding that in confidence. And so I'm so sorry that Brother Harry is an example, that Brother Harry violated your trust. However, I know that right now the wound is open and that you're feeling angry and perhaps thinking about leaving the church, but that's not a reason to leave the church. That's not a reason to leave God, right? That's a reason to leave God. So, I'm going to encourage you to, you might not trust me because I'm another brother, to talk about what's going on, but let's see if we can get help for you. And right now, when people's symptoms are activated, they're less likely to seek help, right? So this is where you as a Brother Morris is going to say, listen, I know this is tough. So I'm going to go ahead and do the research for you and get professional help for you. And then I will come back and let you know. So, and I'll go with you. I've taken time off from work to take someone to the doctor, right? To the psychiatrist, because I feel like I can be an advocate. So, I mean, another member could do the same thing and is expected to do, because again, we're a family. And so I would do that, because in that moment, you can't focus on leaving church right now because they're so activated right now, right? But I promise you, once they get treatment, then you'll be better able to say, hey, that's not a reason to leave church right now. Remember, God is still the head of the church. And as we talk about, the wheat and the tears are here. Sadly, I'm not going to call anybody a tear, but hey, that's not our wheat behavior, right? So if you're not a wheat, then so you want to encourage them to do that, because truth be told, how people treat us is not a reason to leave the church. Right? We're in the church because we understand the value of the church and God's position on the church, right? Remember, we are the church. And so when a person is leaving, it's not just a physical building they're leaving the body of Christ. And so we want to be supportive, and we want to also educate people about what that means as they're in those thoughts. But yes, those thoughts will come. I want to leave. I don't want to come back here because it's painful. And so, you want to encourage them to do that. Visiting another church may be okay, but definitely getting some help is going to be important, because that person's already activated.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Dr. I believe this is Ron.
Yes, sir.
Since we are trying to promote a trauma-informed care church, can you please review once again what we discussed last time, the common manifestations of trauma?
Yes.
Like avoidance, or I remember there were quite a number of it.
Right. Okay. Yes. So let me just quickly go over the definition of trauma. That might be very helpful. And then I'll just talk about the manifestation. Okay. So trauma, for those who were not here last week, is an unexpected and subjective event or series of events that leaves the victim helpless. The event or events usually disrupts the individual's frame of reference. That means how you view the world, and exceeds the ability to cope. So it's your inability to cope that creates a problem. The event may be witnessed or it may be experienced, okay? And so some of the ways it manifests itself is avoidance. They avoid situations and they avoid people and places that reminds them of the trauma. Remember, I shared with you about the director of a clinic. She was very strong, she was very good, she was taking the clinic to places. But when the chairman of the board came and she heard his voice, it reminded her of her husband, who was abusive. And so she was skipping meetings and just wouldn't come because she was just shaking just hearing his voice. And so that's one. And so she was starting to avoid by not coming to the meetings, right? And she needed to be there to chair the meeting, because she was actually, providing a lot of details about the, the progress of the clinic and stuff like that. So she just wouldn't show up. Another symptom is hypervigilance. So, hypervigilance is where the individual is startled by everything. If they hear music play or anything at all, they become startled and becomes very nervous, right? Or anxious, right? And so that's another approach. Then some people have what we call flashbacks. Flashback is where they are just, something reminds them of the situation and they go back and they just feel as if it's happening right now. And so they become so activated that, they're nervous, they're running to hide. They just, sometimes, I've found people like, where are you, Tom? Tom is under the desk all curled up because he's scared, right? And so I have one young lady who, when she was sexually assaulted, there were children, it was a pastor who had sexually assaulted her at this house. She was the singing evangelist for crusade, and the pastor did that. And she said when it was happening to her, she heard children outside that were singing a song. And so whenever she hears that song, it activates her. Or whenever she sees kids at a certain age playing happily, because even though she was being raped, she wanted to close because the window was open and she wanted to close it so that they didn't see what was happening, but she couldn't help it. And so that has never left her because she felt, what if they had seen them become traumatized themselves? And so she always felt guilty about not being able to close the window, even in her traumatic event. And so, she has those flashbacks whenever she sees kids playing happily at a certain age group. She has flashback. And sometimes she says when she sees a kid, if she should run under a table or she'll just start running because she's wanting to get away from them so that they don't see what is happening. Well, what are they going to see? There's nothing happening right now. But right now she's reactivated and it's as if she's reliving the experience all over again. So those are some of the symptoms. Also, it also manifests as depression, again, or anxiety. So when I hear individuals say, hey, I'm often depressed or I'm depressed a lot, and I also have anxiety as well, where they worry about stuff because they don't worry about, is this going to ever happen again, right? They worry. I always ask, my next follow-up question is, have you ever had a traumatic experience? And if yes, what happened? And I would say probably 8 out of 10 times, it's if we fix the trauma, we get rid of the anxiety and the depression. Another way, when I hear they say anxiety and depression, is they're saying, and I'm taking medication, it's not working. Yeah, it's not going to work because you don't have depression like what I call organic depression, where it's biological, where it's just a part of your biological wire, right? You're having depression because of what something happened to you. So if we fix the trauma, it will take care of the anxiety and the depression. Another thing too is that anxiety, when I hear someone say that they're worrying and it makes them feel better, anxiety is always something happened and you're learning to cope by being anxious. So always remember, with anxiety symptoms, whether it's PTSD, whether it's OCD, something happened and you learn to cope by becoming anxious. And so that's kind of where anxiety comes out of.
All right, thank you so much, doctor, because I just feel that that's the first step as we try to develop a trauma-informed care church to recognize those signs, and then hopefully we can go from there. Thank you.
Right, and I do have a program for that as well. The church ever wants to do that because it's becoming very sensitive. I didn't take on this. I didn't take on when I did this before. I did the whole. I modified this because it was a series. But a lot of times when we think of trauma, of course, we talk about that trauma could be domestic violence. Believe me, it's very prevalent in the church. Sexual assault of kids, not just by church members, but also by people in the world, is very prevalent, not just among females, but among males. I don't know if you realize that, 4 to 5 out of every 10 females, so if there are 10 people in the room, 1, 2, 3, 4, or possibly 5 people have been sexually assaulted, right? And so because of that, if you think of your church with 100 people, then if it's 4 to 5 out of it means that it's 40 to 50 out of the entire 100 members have had some sexual assault from a child to adulthood, right? And so having these systems in place where you're able to provide support for your members is healthy. And then when folks are coming in, we talk about homeless people. I don't know how much you know about homeless people, but as they're living out under the bridges and stuff, and we're trying to witness them to bring them into the church, they have had so much trauma, right? Just living out there with the elements, right? And so as they're coming in, and we talk about Christ says in the last days, people are going to be coming in. But Christ also said that we're not only supposed to be spreading the gospel, we're supposed to be attending to what? Their needs, right? Their needs, right? And part of their needs is those emotional needs, right? Those hurts that they're having. We have to attend to them as well so that they can be whole. Because if they're not whole and they're activated, they will not be able to appreciate the love of God and fellowship with Him. It really creates a break. Think about a time when you feel sad because of something at work and you're feeling really down or you're grieving. The average person does not study their lesson and rely on God and all those amazing things you normally do. They shy away, they shut down, and they just can't do anything, right? Some people will, when they're trying moments, will pray more and read more, but that's not the average person. So imagine I'm in church and I'm having all of these mental health issues, how it impacts my relationship with God as well.
Okay, just one more follow-up question, doctor. Isn't rage a common manifestation of a coping behavior from a traumatic experience?
It is not one of the standard. So when I'm doing a diagnosis, it's not one of the standard. So we have, these are the broad, these are the pillars of symptoms that we use to determine that. And then we have some others. So for example, irritability is also one of them, yes. Or anger issues. Yes. So for example, you might wonder, what happened to her? She's always so angry. Check it out. Something happened. Why is she so angry? Something happened, right? So, not always, but most of the time, she's responding in a way that makes her feel safe. Okay. And so I would always want to gently explore those possibilities.
What I'm thinking is that when there's a specific scenario or condition, the way the person reacts is so full of rage and anger, that could be one of the signs, right? Like some other regular people would just say would just dislike the situation, but for him or her, he or she reacts very violently. That could be
Yes, correct. Yes, correct. And also somebody who is very combative and very defensive, always trying to, I always have to protect myself because of what happened to me. I'm always going to have to defend myself. They're very defensive and very guarded and very defensive. Yeah, those are also some of the minor symptoms that individuals exhibit, or behaviors rather, people exhibit.
Yeah, thank you, doctor.
I got a quick question. Would you say that someone that has gone to jail, I guess maybe for 6 months or more, would that be trauma, or would that just be like based on the individual's experience?
So I've worked in prisons. I mean, if you heard my portfolio last week, I've worked in jails. I'm currently operating a clinic that is within a prison, and I can't begin to tell you the stories, that I've heard. A lot of times I have to intervene on behalf of patients because, they may have said or did something that was wrong, but sometimes the way they're treated where, they're being grabbed and stand against the wall, that's traumatic. Or they're being sprayed with pepper spray, if you've ever had where they're being gassed. It's horrible, right? And that's traumatic for individuals. Or, where, they're just, being kicked around and beat around. That's hard. Or even with other gang members, or a lot of sexual assaults. I remember one of the most unforgettable experience I had when I worked, I was doing a psych eval in a jail. And after I saw the guy was begging me, please don't leave me, because he was going back to get a sexual assaulted. It happened this morning. He's going back, and the guy was locked up, had no care about time, and he was going to do it again. And that for me was hard because I could not remove him from the environment because he's in jail. I could not stay forever with him because I have to go back to work. And so I had to walk away with a lot of pain knowing that they've been assaulted. So being in jail can be, I'm not saying everyone who's gone there has had that experience, but being in jail is generally traumatic.
Thank you.
Or prison as well, yes.
Are you located in Houston?
I am in Houston, yes.
All right.
I'm in Houston. And I will post my number just in case anyone has any, further question at some point in time. They can always feel free to reach out to me. So it's this is a very critical topic. I tell folks all the time because you can't imagine how much pain individuals are going through, even with smiling. And I admire folks who are willing to share their story or who are willing to just talk about the pain they're going through. And it's hard to say that as Christians, we walk around with all of this pain, and it impairs our relationship with Christ, right? So we really want to get rid of these pains so that our vertical relationship can grow, and also our horizontal relationships as well can grow from there. Any other question?
I
I just want to thank you so much for this exceptionally well plotted out, organized program that you have brought us. And I'm really looking forward to that time where we can dig a little deeper with our church. So thank you so much.
It is my pleasure. It is my pleasure. I find this very important because, I thank God because I think I was raised in a church. I was raised in Jamaica, in a church where we were encouraged to be very vocal. We had folks who were like really mother figures for us, and we could share our hurts. But as I'm looking back, I'm figuring how many times I could have been abused, right? And so thank God that I was able to circumvent those. But then I've had my own secondary trauma, right? Observing individuals getting assaulted and abused, or just hearing their stories leaves me overwhelmed. But I praise God that I'm able to provide support to individuals. In fact, I'll share this with you. When I was accepted into doing my postdoc in trauma, I was like, it's just like a one pager where I know what PTSD is, I know what the symptoms are, what else is there to know? And this postdoc was for a whole year. And I'm telling you, the amount of things that we had to go through, the course of study and just the whole experience, and people are sharing with you the depths of their trauma and how it has impacted them. People have committed suicide as a result because they are just hopeless. They can't talk about it, and we have these evidence-based programs. We have a program, a very good one called cognitive processing therapy, where we are rewiring their minds and how they're thinking. Because they're thinking that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And then because of their traumatic event, they're saying, well, something bad happened to me, so I must be bad. And if you think you're bad, are you going to be motivated to worship God? No, because I'm bad. I'm not going to go to heaven, right? And you'd be amazed at how many victims blame themselves for something that is totally not their fault. Like I say to ladies all the time, even if you went to his apartment at 3 a.m. and you said no, it's no. And what I also wanted to know is that please don't ever think that it's only females that have been having trauma, like even sexual trauma. The prevalence among men is, I would say, equal, because these events happen when they were what? Perhaps younger by an older person. And so, hey, they're not the strong football player that you see today. They were once younger kids, who were perhaps lanky and weak and poor self-esteem that was victimized. So, we want to think of trauma across the board. Also, if, even with medical trauma as well, if you're having an accident or whatever it is, it's important to start getting your voice. And getting your voice is start talking about it, right? And how do we talk about it? The church can start it. Start by creating a trauma-informed care church. That's the first approach. And then hopefully get it out into your communities. As you become more trauma-informed care, and as you get trained how to provide support groups, maybe in your local areas, you can invite folks, advertise, hey, we're holding a trauma support group here at our church, and see how many members are going to come, because people just want an opportunity to share. They can't afford treatment. And so, hey, if I can go with other people, one, I'm getting strength that, wow, there are 30 of us. Because a lot of times people have had trauma think that they're alone. Oh, I'm the only one, right? Because nobody's talking, right? And they see 30 people. Wow, there are other people like me. And then you're learning about people who are talking about how they have been coping. I never thought about that. Maybe I could try. Maybe I could try. Or when someone tells like, hey, I've been trying this program, it's been working for me. And so you're gonna be like, okay, there goes one testimonial. Then there goes two, then maybe I can try as well. So it's kind of create motivation for individuals. And again, it's also support. It's also support. So that's why it's called a support group, where people go and realize that, hey, I have support here because people like myself are here, and we're going to support each other through this process.
How do you deal with, say, maybe someone in the church, right, that clearly has experienced trauma? Because, all right, so maybe they're displaying symptoms of borderline personality disorder, right? They're irritable, and because they're irritable, they now, and they refuse help, okay? And now people don't they're isolating them. They don't want to be around them, first of all, because they deny help, and they're not very nice to be around. How do you address that?
So I know it's very difficult because one of the things that we as clinicians we say is to each other is when I work with a client and I'm really tired after that session, I know I'm working with the borderline, right? And that's one of the things that we say among ourselves. And so sometimes it can be very difficult to work with these individuals, but even like for myself, a lot of times when I go to them, they'll curse me out. They'll say real unkind things. But one of the things I'm committed to doing as a Christian is that Christ never gave up on us. And if we are Christ-like, we are going to ask God to give us. It's no longer Ainsworth. It's about the Christ in me that's going to love Brother Brown or love Sister Jane and work with her and that's understanding trauma. They are helpless. They are helpless. And so what do you do with someone who has Alzheimer's? Not remembering your name, cursing profanity, the sweet lady you've always known, right? She's always been sweet, she's always been kind, and now suddenly she's not remembering me. She's calling me Tom when my name is John. She's using profanity. She's sometimes saying sexually inappropriate things to me. And we know she has Alzheimer's. What do? Do we knock her over the head, or do we accept that, okay, she has a mental health issues, the symptoms are common, so those are she's presenting or exhibiting the symptoms that are consistent with that diagnosis. What do? It's certainly not Christ-like to not work with them or to support them, because now you have to understand that they have a mental health issue and that they are oftentimes incapable of helping themselves. And so that's where the love. I'm thinking if my mother was to develop Alzheimer's, I love my mother. I would never, for any reason, abandon her or avoid her. I'm thinking of my daughter. If my daughter or my wife was supposed to suddenly develop mental health issues, what do? Kick her to the curb, lock her in a room, and throw away the keys? No, I'm going to still be her husband. I'm going to still be her father, right? Because that's what we do. We are a family. And so by extension, Christ says that, and I believe that firmly, that my church family is my strongest family. Why? Because we're not only going to be family here on earth, but family in heaven. So I am not going to abandon. I'm going to do everything I can to do that. Now, sometimes I know that is very difficult, but if you ask God to just shine through you and to pour in you his peace and his strength, you definitely will be able to overcome.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Lightbody.
Yes.
I've seen on TV, for example, a parent, the child is murdered, right? And yet they can turn around and forgive the murderer. And even as a follow-up, meet with that individual, trying to help that person to cope with the action that was so devastating to them. I mean, I know forgiveness plays a major role, and also the fact that you have to have you have to have a strong relationship with God, because how do you wrap your mind around something like that? I mean, anybody can say, I forgive you, but to cope with it and to encounter the individual, what's the best way you could advise someone to deal with a situation like that?
You see, so whenever I do a trauma presentation, and like a series of it, I usually have one session is about forgiveness, especially when it relates to sexual trauma or physical abuse. I usually have one session where I have two past clients I have. One young lady, she was sexually assaulted by a young man, and when we started working, she saw herself as she was a really good writer. And so she read poems about when she wrote a poem about the experience she had. It was just so dark, all these things. And I said to her, I want you to rewrite that poem from a victor's standpoint. And as we were working through our sessions, I mean, it was amazing. Like, for example, she says, when I went there, I was so weak. I let him, you know, abused me. And then as she was writing, she wrote that, that he was filled with the devil or whatever it was, and he overpowered me, right? And so she was now putting the blame back. All these things, all those putting herself down, and it was my fault to go there. She's saying that I went there to visit with pure intents, and he messed that up by assaulting me. So she was rewriting that stuff. And so we did fasting, we did prayer together. One of the things we worked on that was pretty tough was forgiveness piece. And so we worked through that, and it was so interesting that after we fasted one Sabbath, that 3 days later, she called me and said, Dr. Dr. I said, what happened? She says, the young man reached out to me on Facebook. Now, this assault happened like maybe 7 years at the time when we were doing our sessions. And she said he reached out. I said, what am I going to do? I said, well, this is your chance to test how well, if you have truly forgiven him. And she reached out to him, and interestingly, and I said to her, don't go expecting anything, don't go with emotions, just go to hear. But I felt she was ready too, because we had really come a long ways. And she said the guy came on, and without even saying anything, he was just crying how sorry he was, how he could, he's married and he told his wife because he couldn't keep it. And she realized that he was just tormented all this time. He said when he was supposed to have relations with his wife, he couldn't touch her because every time he was trying to touch her, he could see what he did. All he could see was her face. And so, that was really horrible for them. And so he would have a really difficult time with his wife. And so they were able to talk about it. His wife was, very supportive of the situation. She understood. At first, she was very disappointed and angry, but, she worked with him through that. He got sessions himself. And that was the biggest part of the resolution for my client, where she forgave him, and just to hear that God was on the other hand working it out for her, it blew her mind. And so I usually bring her on to do that piece about forgiveness. And then I had a wife also who was being assaulted by her husband, physically assaulted by her husband, to come and share her story. And so that part was also interesting. So I bring those on so that folks can get to realize that forgiveness is not an option for Christians, right? Because not forgiving someone prevents God. There's some things I say that God cannot do, right? One, he says his word, before his word changes, heaven and earth will pass away, which means that his words will never change. In the Bible, he says that what? He says, if you cannot forgive your brother, your heavenly Father, can't forgive you, right? So it means that he can't forgive you, right? So forgiving someone who has assaulted you or abused you is not an option, but we have to work through it, right? So through treatment or through, whatever we're doing, we have to get there. And then loving the person, the Beatitudes talk about loving those who hate you or do evil towards you, right? And the Bible also says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. So forgiving and loving abusers is a requirement, right? As we work towards eternity. And so as we're building our characters for eternity, as we're perfecting our lives for eternity, we have to ask God to give us that strength. That comes from God. And so when I'm working with individuals, I let them know, hey, I'm not doing this. I'm doing this by the power of God invested in me. And so that's kind of where we go with this, right? But forgiveness is hard, but it is so possible because God knows that in order to get to heaven, we have to forgive.
Thank you, Dr. Lightbody. Appreciate it.
No worries. All right, it's 9:02. If there's no more question, I will stop here. But again, I will go on if you have more questions. But if you have no more questions, I will stop here. And again, I'm available if you guys want to do a whole series, but something I want you guys to really think about and just think about how you can prepare to support your community. Because remember, a lot of times they're so resistant to the gospel. But if we're going in, we talk about if we're going in and we're providing support for them in different ways, that's an outreach that's going to provide great inreach for us in our churches. All right, Brother Ron, I think there are no more questions, and so I'll turn over to you, sir.
Oh yes, I guess everyone has been very much blessed by your presentation tonight, Dr. Lightbody. We appreciate so much your effort and being clear and very much informative. I would like to thank you once again personally for accepting this um, invitation to speak
Thanks.
to us on this matter. And I would like to thank everyone to for joining tonight. And we hope that we will have a blessed Sabbath as we fellowship with the Lord on His holy day. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and let us all have a good night.
Thank you. Happy Sabbath, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Happy Sabbath.
Good night. Happy Sabbath, everyone.